All right, let's go. Number 10. The boiling of Richard Roose. In February of 1531, something went wrong with a pot of soup. The soup had been prepared in the kitchen of John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester, and served to his household as it had been served every evening for years. By morning, 17 people were sick. 2 of them were dead. They were not nobility, they were not clergy, they were poor visitors who had come to the bishop's table for a charitable meal. A cook named Richard Roose was arrested within days. But the crime itself is not what belongs on this list. Poisoning was already a capital offense in England. Henry could have hanged Roose under existing law, and no one would have remembered his name. What puts Richard Roose on this list is what Henry did instead. He went to Parliament. He asked them to write a law that had never existed in England before. A law that would apply to one man, for one crime, prescribing a method of death that no English statute had ever authorized. And Parliament said yes. The method was boiling alive. At Smithfield, in front of a crowd, a large cauldron was set over a fire and filled with water. Roose was brought to the site in chains. The historical record does not agree on whether he was lowered into cold water and heated gradually or plunged into water already at temperature. What the records do agree on is the result. A human body submerged in boiling water does not die quickly. The skin reddens, then blisters, then separates. The convulsions are involuntary and violent. The sounds carry. Witnesses at Smithfield reported that Roose was alive and conscious for a considerable period of time. The crowd watched the entirety of it. This was not a hidden execution behind prison walls. This was a public performance, staged at one of London's most visible gathering points, designed to be seen by as many people as possible. The mechanism that made it possible moved faster than almost any legislation in Tudor history. The Act passed both Houses of Parliament in fewer than 14 days. There is no recorded debate in the Lords, no dissent, no request for amendment. 14 days to create an entirely new category of legal death, and the document sat on the statute books for more than a decade afterward. That speed is not the speed of justice. It is the speed of compliance. Parliament did not deliberate. Parliament obeyed. The 2 people who actually died from the poisoned soup were not members of Fisher's household. They were not the intended targets, if indeed Fisher himself was the target. They were poor visitors, dependents of the bishop's charity, people who had come to the table because they had nowhere else to eat. Roose was a cook, a servant. Henry VIII invented a spectacular new form of legal killing and applied it to a man who ladled soup for a living. The nobility of Fisher's household recovered. The charitable guests did not. The distance between who suffered and who was avenged tells its own story. The act did not end with Roose. It was used at least twice more. A maidservant was boiled at Smithfield later that same year. Another poisoner was executed by the same method in 1542. Henry had created a legal instrument for a single occasion, and the instrument outlived the occasion. It sat in the statute books, available to anyone who wanted to use it, for years after the cook's bones had been pulled from the cauldron. The precedent was the horror, not the individual death, but the proof that a king could manufacture a law, apply it backward in time, and leave it loaded for the next person who became convenient to destroy. That backward application is the detail that survives everything else. Roose committed the crime before the act existed. The law was written after his arrest and applied retroactively to a deed already done. The principle that a person cannot be punished under a law that did not exist when they acted is one of the oldest protections in legal philosophy. Henry violated it with the full cooperation of both Houses of Parliament, and no voice in the historical record objected. Emergency legislation, written after the fact, applied to a specific individual, in response to public outrage. The pattern is not confined to the 16th century. It recurs in every century since, wearing different clothes each time. Historian K.J. Kesselring at Dalhousie University documented the parliamentary records of the Act's passage in her work on Tudor criminal law and found no evidence of opposition, amendment, or meaningful debate in either chamber. But here is where the standard explanation falls apart. The standard reading is that Henry overreacted to a poisoning, excessive royal cruelty aimed at a cook. But John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester, was one of the most prominent opponents of Henry's planned divorce from Catherine of Aragon. Fisher would be arrested, tried, and beheaded 4 years later for refusing the oath of supremacy. The poisoning of Fisher's household in 1531 was not a random kitchen crime. Someone put poison in the bishop's soup. The question the Act of Parliament was designed to prevent anyone from asking is who told the cook to do it. A public boiling is a spectacular way to silence a man before he can answer that question in a courtroom. The punishment was not the point. The silence was. The water was the least of it. What boiled that day at Smithfield was the principle that the law existed before the king decided what it should say. Henry did not just kill Richard Roose. He proved that Parliament would let him rewrite the rules of death itself, apply them backward, and use them to bury whatever he needed buried. The cook in the cauldron was a demonstration. The audience was not the crowd. The audience was every person in England who might one day need to be reminded what the king could do. Before we continue to the next item, here's a little something for you. If you're the type of person who wants to keep learning but doesn't always have time to sit down and watch, we put all of our stuff on Spotify. That way your drive becomes a history lesson. Your evening walk becomes a trip through the dark ages. Even falling asleep becomes something worthwhile. And the best thing is that you can listen without any ads or interruptions. The link is right there in the comments section, and honestly, it might change how you spend your downtime. Alright, let's keep going with the next item. Number 9. Thomas Cromwell. On the morning of June 10, 1540, Thomas Cromwell walked into a meeting of the Privy Council at Westminster. He had attended hundreds of such meetings over the previous decade. He had controlled the outcomes of most of them. He had drafted the agendas, managed the personnel, and shaped the decisions that emerged. Partway through the session, the Duke of Norfolk rose from his seat and informed Cromwell that he was under arrest. The charges had already been written. The man who had drafted more legislation than any figure in Tudor government was now subject to a document he had not been permitted to read before it was used against him. The charges were heresy and treason, filed simultaneously. That combination was not an accident. It was an architectural decision. Heresy meant Cromwell had departed from Orthodox religion. Treason meant he had acted against the king. The two accusations pointed in opposite directions. Any defense against one charge reinforced the other. A man could not prove his religious orthodoxy without implying loyalty to Rome, and he could not prove loyalty to the crown without implying indifference to doctrine. The trap had no exit. It was not designed to have one. This was not a prosecution. It was a piece of engineering, and the engineers had built it to be escape-proof. What Cromwell had constructed for Henry over the previous 10 years was nothing less than the administrative skeleton of a New England. The legal architecture of the break with Rome, the Act of Supremacy, the Succession Acts, the dissolution of the monasteries, the network of commissioners, informants, and enforcers that made the English Reformation not a theological event, but a bureaucratic one. In a single decade, one man had redesigned the relationship between the English crown and every institution that had previously limited its power. The volume of legislation Cromwell shepherded through Parliament in those years exceeded the combined output of every Lord Chancellor in the previous half-century. He did not merely serve the king, he rebuilt the kingdom around the king. And then the king looked at the builder and saw not a servant, but a man who knew exactly how to dismantle what he had assembled. The morning of July 28, 1540. Tower Hill. The scaffold had been erected in the usual place. The crowd had gathered. Cromwell delivered a speech. Then the axe fell. The first blow did not sever the head. The headsman lifted the axe and struck again. The second blow did not finish it either. It took 3 strikes to separate Cromwell's head from his body. Eyewitnesses recorded the sound of the crowd during the interval between the first and third blow. 3 strikes from a headsman who either lacked the skill or lacked the nerve to do what every person present was waiting for him to do. The man who had engineered the most efficient bureaucratic revolution in English history was killed by someone who could not do his job properly. Within weeks, Henry reportedly told his counselors that they had caused him to put to death the most faithful servant he ever had. Cromwell's name was removed from official records. His coat of arms was taken down. The architect was demolished, but every wall he had built remained standing. The Church of England continued. The dissolution continued. The succession acts continued. The informant networks continued. Cromwell vanished from the record, and the machinery he had created ran without him, which was precisely the point. The system no longer needed its builder. Every corporation that has ever dissolved the department that designed its most profitable product understands the logic perfectly. The pattern has not changed in 5 centuries. Historian Diarmaid MacCulloch at Oxford documented the timeline of Cromwell's fall in his biography published in 2018, noting that the charges were drawn up before any formal investigation had been conducted. But here is where the standard explanation falls apart. The conventional reading is that Cromwell miscalculated. He arranged the marriage to Anne of Cleves, Henry was repulsed, and Cromwell paid the price for a political misstep. But the Cleves marriage was the excuse, not the cause. Cromwell was not destroyed because he failed, he was destroyed because he succeeded. The machinery he had built worked so efficiently that the king could see 2 things with perfect clarity. First, that he no longer needed the machinist, and second, what the machinist could do to a kingdom if he ever turned those same tools in a different direction. Cromwell was not a casualty of incompetence. He was a casualty of demonstrated competence. He was not killed for failing. He was killed for showing a king what a single capable man could do to a kingdom, and for being that man. The lesson was not lost on any minister who served a Tudor monarch after him. Competence was not protection, it was provocation. The more indispensable a servant made himself, the more clearly the person above him could see the shape of the threat. Cromwell had built the machine. The machine's first fully successful product was his own destruction. Number 8. Catherine Howard. Roughly 16 years old when she was married. 49 years old, the man she married. Roughly 19 years old when she was executed. The entire arc of Catherine Howard's life as Queen Consort of England fits inside a window of fewer than 600 days. In that span, a teenager was placed in the bed of a king, accused of crimes that almost certainly predated the marriage itself, and killed for them. 600 days from crown to scaffold. That is not a reign, that is a verdict, with a delay built in. Hampton Court in the autumn of 1541. The long galleries were cold. The stone held the chill of the season, and released it slowly through the night. Candles burned in iron brackets along the walls, throwing uneven light across the corridors. It was through these galleries that Catherine allegedly ran on the night she learned she was under investigation. The story, passed down through the household, is that she broke away from her attendants and sprinted toward the chapel where Henry was at prayer, screaming for an audience, screaming for the chance to explain. The guards caught her before she reached the door. The door stayed closed. Whether the account is literally true or an invention of the household's collective memory, the architecture makes it physically possible. The gallery is real. The chapel is real. The distance between them is roughly 40 yards. And the image that survives across 5 centuries is a teenage girl running through a stone corridor toward a closed door, and the door not opening. The marriage itself was a physical ordeal. Henry was 49, weighed an estimated 300 pounds, and suffered from a chronic ulcerated wound on his leg that required daily draining and dressing. The smell was noted by attendants. The wound had troubled him for years, and would trouble him until his death. The bed that Catherine entered at roughly 16 was shared with a body in visible medical decline, a body that carried the odor of an open infection that would not heal. The gap between the girl and the man she was placed beside is not a historical abstraction. It is a physical reality that every lady in waiting at court could smell from the corridor. The charges that brought her down hinged on premarital sexual conduct with Francis Dereham and Thomas Culpeper. The investigators needed to establish that Catherine had been unchaste before the marriage, which retroactively constituted treason because the king had been deceived about her virginity. The interrogations probed her time in the household of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, where Catherine had lived as a girl. The household was effectively unsupervised. Young women shared dormitories. Older men in the household had access. The concept of consent as it applied to a girl of 13 or 14 in a crowded aristocratic dormitory in 1536 simply did not function the way the prosecutors needed it to function. They needed her to have chosen. The circumstances suggest she was never in a position where choice was available to her. The testimony came from the women around her, Lady Rochford, the ladies in waiting, the dormitory companions from the Dowager Duchess's household. Their words survive in state documents, extracted under interrogation, shaped by the knowledge that the wrong answer could put them on the scaffold alongside her. Catherine's own voice is almost entirely absent from the records that survive. She is described, accused, interpreted, and condemned by the words of others. The girl at the center of the prosecution is the person whose actual words appear least in the evidence assembled to destroy her. The silence where her testimony should be is louder than anything the witnesses said. Historian Gareth Russell, in his study of Catherine Howard published in 2017, analyzed the dormitory arrangements and supervision structures of the Dowager Duchess's household, and found a consistent pattern of negligent oversight that made the young women in the household functionally unprotected. But here is where the conventional reading collapses into something stranger. Catherine Howard was not reckless. She was unprotected. The household she grew up in provided no supervision, no privacy, and no mechanism for a girl to refuse the attention of older men with authority over her. The same institutional system that failed to protect her as a child prosecuted her for the consequences of that failure as an adult. The adults who failed to supervise the dormitory were not charged. The adults who placed her in the king's bed knowing her history were not charged. The only person who was destroyed was the teenager at the center of a system that had used her at every stage and discarded her when the use became inconvenient. She was roughly 19 years old. The system that killed her was centuries older than she was, and it survived her without a scratch. The household that did not protect her continued. The court that convicted her continued. The king who married her married again within 18 months. Catherine Howard vanished into the silence of the historical record, and the institutions that produced her, failed her, and destroyed her carried on as though she had never existed at all. Number 7. The Carthusian Martyrs. The London Charterhouse in the spring of 1535 was one of the quietest places in England. The Carthusian monks lived in individual cells, arranged around a central cloister. They ate alone, they prayed alone. They spoke only during designated hours, and most of those hours were given to God rather than to conversation. The daily rhythm was silence, prayer, silence, labor, silence, prayer again. It had been this way for generations. It was into this silence that the king's commissioners arrived with a document and a question. The document was the oath of supremacy. The question was whether each monk would sign it. The answer from Prior John Houghton and several of his brothers was the answer that would take them to Tyburn. The method prescribed for traitors was hanging, drawing, and quartering. The sequence was precise and deliberate. The condemned was hanged by the neck but cut down while still conscious. Then the executioner opened the abdomen and drew out the intestines while the person was still alive. Then the body was beheaded and divided into 4 quarters. The duration of consciousness during the early stages varied, but the accounts of the Carthusian executions on May 4, 1535, agree that Prior John Houghton was alive and aware when the executioner's knife entered his chest. The distance from the Charterhouse to Tyburn was roughly 3 miles. The monks traveled 3 miles from the quietest place in England to the most violent public spectacle the Tudor state could stage. The specific wording of the oath mattered. It required every subject to affirm that the king, not the pope, was the supreme head of the Church of England. The Carthusians would not say it. Not because they mounted a theological argument, not because they drafted a public objection. They simply would not speak the words. Under existing law, that distinction should have been meaningful. Silence and refusal were not the same thing, but the act of supremacy had been written to close that gap. Failure to affirm was legally identical to denial. The law did not recognize the space between speaking against the king and declining to speak for him. The monks occupied a position that did not exist in the legal framework. They were punished for standing in a place the law had decided could not be stood in. The question that survives every explanation is this: how does a man choose the specific agony of being disemboweled alive over speaking a single sentence he does not believe? Every psychological framework that attempts to bridge that gap, faith, conviction, stubbornness, falls short of the physical reality of the scaffold. After the executions, the quarters of the monks' bodies were distributed across London. Remains were mounted on the gates of the city. The Charterhouse itself reportedly received a portion. One account claims the arm of a monk was nailed to the monastery door. The distribution was not random. It was geographic messaging. Every major entry point into London displayed a piece of what happened to men who would not speak. Every Londoner, no matter which direction they approached from, would encounter the evidence before they reached the city center. The body parts were not waste. They were punctuation marks in a sentence written across the surface of the city. Thomas More was in the Tower when the Carthusians were taken to Tyburn. He watched them leave. The two refusals ran on parallel tracks. More, the Lord Chancellor, had resigned and retreated into silence. The Carthusians, the monks, had never left silence. Both were heading toward the same scaffold. More reportedly told his daughter Margaret, upon seeing the monks led out, that they went to their deaths as cheerfully as bridegrooms going to their marriage. More would follow them to the block within weeks. The requirement to affirm a specific belief or face destruction was not invented by the Tudors. It recurs in every century, wearing different names: loyalty oaths, purity tests, compulsory affirmations. The mechanism is always the same. The state defines a sentence. The subject must speak it. The penalty for silence is indistinguishable from the penalty for opposition. The Carthusians had taken a vow of silence and solitude. Their entire spiritual practice was built around the deliberate rejection of public life. They had asked to be left alone with God. Henry dragged them out of their cells and into the most public spectacle of violence the state could produce. The punishment was not merely execution. It was the specific inversion of everything the Carthusians had chosen to be. Men of silence, killed loudly. Men of solitude, killed in front of thousands. Men of withdrawal, displayed on the city gates. Historian Vincent Nichols documented the geographic distribution of the martyrs' remains across London, confirming that the placements corresponded to the city's principal entry points. But here is where the nightmare begins. The Carthusians were not dangerous. They had no army, no political constituency, no diplomatic connections, no leverage of any kind. They were the least threatening religious order in England. They grew food. They prayed. They copied manuscripts. Henry killed them first not because they were the loudest opposition, but because they were the quietest. The Carthusians were not a threat. They were a calibration exercise. Their deaths tested the machinery on a target that could not fight back, before it was aimed at targets that could. Once the system proved it could reach into silence and extract a body, no one in England was beyond its range. They had asked only to be left alone. That was the one thing the New England could not permit. A man who wants nothing from the state is a man the state cannot control. And a man who cannot be controlled must be destroyed, not because of what he might do, but because of what his existence implies. The Carthusians implied that it was possible to live outside the king's authority. For that implication alone, they were dragged from their cells and butchered in public. The silence they had chosen became the silence they were given. The difference is that the first silence was theirs. The second was Henry's. Number 6. Catherine of Aragon. In January of 1536, a messenger arrived at the court of Henry VIII, carrying a letter from Kimbolton Castle. The letter had been written by a woman who had not been permitted to see her own daughter in over 2 years. The woman was dying, and she knew it. The letter was addressed to the king. It was signed Catherine the Queen. She had been told, repeatedly and with increasing force, that she was no longer Queen of England. She had been stripped of her title, her household, her companions, and her health. She signed the letter as Queen anyway. She was dead within days of writing it. Catherine's resistance was not passive. It was legal, diplomatic, and relentless. She appealed to Pope Clement VII, arguing that her marriage to Henry was valid and that only the Pope had the authority to dissolve it. She was correct on the law as it stood. She refused to accept the title Dowager Princess of Wales, which would have acknowledged the annulment. She refused to vacate the Queen's apartments voluntarily. Every legal instrument available to her she used. Every diplomatic channel she could reach, she activated. And every move she made, Henry neutralized. The annulment proceeded. The appeal to Rome was overridden by the Act of Supremacy. The law was rewritten around her objections. Catherine's arguments were sound. They were also irrelevant, because the man judging the case was the man she was arguing against. The crisis did not stay in England. Catherine was the aunt of Emperor Charles V, the most powerful ruler in Europe. The annulment threatened to fracture the diplomatic architecture of the entire continent. Papal legates, imperial ambassadors, and French intermediaries spent years attempting to resolve what was, at its core, one king's determination to replace one wife with another. The volume of diplomatic correspondence generated across European courts by the marriage question exceeded that of most military conflicts of the decade. Wars produced fewer dispatches. The spectacle of a king attempting to discard a queen who would not be discarded consumed the attention of every major court on the continent for the better part of a decade. That is the scale of what Catherine's single word, queen, held in place. The exile was gradual and systematic, first from the court, then to the moor, a royal residence still suitable for a woman of rank, then to Buckton, more remote, then to Kimbolton, damp, cold, and effectively a prison without the legal designation. Each move took Catherine farther from London, farther from power, and farther from her daughter Mary. The separation from Mary was total and enforced. Catherine was not permitted to see her daughter. Letters were monitored. Visitors were reported. Her household shrank. The servants who remained were watched by agents of the crown. Her health declined in buildings that were never meant for long habitation. The rooms were cold. The walls were wet. The food was uncertain. What disappeared from Catherine's world came away in layers. First the courtiers, then the ladies-in-waiting, then the visitors, then the correspondence, then the daughter. Year by year the circle contracted. The woman who had been married to the King of England for 24 years, who had been crowned and anointed, who had borne 6 children and buried 5 of them, was reduced to a handful of monitored servants in a damp castle in Huntingdonshire. The architecture of isolation was not violent, it was administrative. No one struck Catherine. No one dragged her from her bed. The state simply removed every human being from her life, one by one, until there was no one left. Historian Patrick Williams documented the conditions of Catherine's final residences, noting in his study published in 2012 that Kimbolton's dampness and structural deficiencies were well known to the Crown's agents who approved her transfer there. But here is where the standard explanation falls apart. The conventional reading is that Catherine was stubborn. She could have accepted the title of Dowager Princess, acknowledged the annulment, and lived comfortably on a pension. The implication is that her suffering was, in some measure, her own choice. But Catherine could not accept the annulment without consequences that went far beyond her own comfort. If she accepted that the marriage was invalid, her daughter Mary became illegitimate. Mary's claim to the succession vanished. Mary's legal status as a person of royal blood collapsed. Catherine was not defending a title. She was defending her daughter's right to exist as a legitimate human being in the eyes of the law. Every refusal, every signed letter, every insistence on the word queen was a mother shielding her child with the only weapon she had left, a single word. She died at Kimbolton Castle on January 7, 1536. She was 50 years old. She had not seen her daughter in years. The servants who attended her were strangers appointed by the crown. The letter she wrote to Henry in her final days was signed the way she had always signed it, Catherine the Queen. The word was all she had left, and she would not let him have it. The marriage lasted 24 years. The exile lasted 3. The word lasted until the ink was dry, and the hand that held the pen went still. It outlived everything except the daughter it was written to protect. Number 5. Thomas More, 440 days. That is roughly how long Thomas More sat in the Tower of London, waiting to be killed for something he did not say. He was not accused of speaking against the king. He was not accused of writing against the king. He was not accused of conspiring, plotting, or communicating with the king's enemies. He was accused of remaining silent when silence was no longer permitted. For 440 days, the most accomplished legal mind in England sat in a cell, believing that the law he had spent his life mastering would protect him. He was wrong. More's strategy was built on a single legal principle. Under English common law, silence could not be construed as denial. A man who refused to speak could not be convicted of opposing the thing he refused to speak about. More believed this with the certainty of a man who had spent decades inside the legal system. He was Lord Chancellor. He had read the statutes. He had applied them. He had sentenced men under them. The principle was clear. Silence was not refusal. Refusal was not treason. The space between them was the space in which More intended to survive. Then the Treason Act of 1534 was amended. The amendment closed the gap. Silence was reclassified. It was no longer neutral. It was no longer protected. Under the new wording, failure to affirm the oath of supremacy was legally identical to denial of it. The legal ground beneath More's feet was removed while he was standing on it. He had trusted the architecture. The architecture was redesigned around him. More had been Lord Chancellor, the highest legal office in England. He had personally overseen the prosecution of heretics. He had authorized the arrest and imprisonment of men who distributed William Tyndale's English translation of the Bible. He had endorsed the burning of books, and by some accounts, approved the burning of people. The man who enforced conformity of belief on others was now being destroyed for exercising his own conscience. The irony is not incidental, it is structural. More had spent years strengthening the principle that the state could punish a man for what he believed. Henry did not invent that principle. He inherited it, expanded it, and turned it on the man who had helped establish it. More built the precedent. Henry changed the definition of which beliefs qualified. The machinery was the same. The operator was different. The scaffold on Tower Hill, July 6, 1535. More had been held in the Tower for over a year. He had aged visibly. His hair had grown long. He was thin. He climbed the scaffold and reportedly spoke briefly. The words attributed to him have survived in multiple versions, but the core statement is consistent across sources. He died the king's good servant, but God's first. One blow from the headsman. Clean. The head was taken and placed on a pike on London Bridge, where it remained for a month. Every person crossing the bridge for the next 30 days walked beneath the head of the former Lord Chancellor of England. 1 month of public display for a man whose crime was not speaking. The silence he had chosen in life became the spectacle he was given in death. The right to remain silent. The legal principle that no person can be compelled to testify against themselves and that silence cannot be used as evidence of guilt is one of the foundations of modern jurisprudence. It appears in constitutions and legal codes across the world. The principle did not exist in the form More needed it to exist. It arrived centuries later, in part because of cases like his. More did not establish the right. His death demonstrated the catastrophic consequences of its absence. The modern protection exists because someone, eventually, looked at what happened when silence could be prosecuted and decided that a legal system that punished silence was a legal system that had abandoned any pretense of justice. The principle arrived too late to save the man whose case made its necessity undeniable. Historian John Guy at the University of Cambridge analyzed the legal transformation of silence into treason under the amended Treason Act in his biography of More, published in 2000, noting that the statutory change was drafted specifically to close the legal position More had constructed. But here is where the nightmare begins. More was not simply a principled man who died for his faith. He was a man who had operated the same machinery against others. He had prosecuted heretics. He had endorsed the suppression of English scripture. He had participated in a system that punished men for believing the wrong things. The system that killed Thomas More was a system Thomas More had helped to build. His death is not a simple martyrdom. It is the moment the machine turned and consumed its own operator. The principle he had enforced, that the state could reach into a man's conscience and punish what it found there, did not change when it was applied to him. Only the target changed. He died the king's good servant, but God's first. He had spent his career ensuring that other men did not have that choice. He had sent men to prison and to death for the crime of following their own conscience, instead of the conscience the state prescribed. And in the end, the state prescribed a conscience for him, and he could not follow it, and the machinery he had endorsed did exactly what it was designed to do. The only difference was that this time, the man on the scaffold had helped build the scaffold. The machine did not malfunction. It performed precisely as intended. The malfunction was believing it would never turn around. Number 4. The Pilgrimage of Grace. In the autumn of 1536, in towns across the north of England, monks were being evicted from their monasteries. The dissolution had reached Lincolnshire and Yorkshire. The hospitals were closing. The schools were closing. The almshouses that had fed the poor for generations were being stripped of their lead and their timber. For a few weeks, people in the northern counties watched in silence as the institutions that had cared for their communities were dismantled. Then, in October, A lawyer named Robert Aske stood before a crowd in Yorkshire, and the silence ended. Within days, 30,000 armed men were marching south. The monasteries were not churches in the modern sense, they were infrastructure. In the north of England, the nearest physician was often a monk. The nearest school was a monastic school. The nearest bed for a sick traveler was in a monastic hostel. The nearest meal for a destitute family was at a monastic gate. When the dissolution reached the northern counties, it did not remove a set of religious buildings. It removed the hospitals, the schools, the hostels, and the food supply of entire communities. The estimated number of charitable meals served daily by monastic houses in the northern counties alone ran into the thousands. The number that replaced them was 0. Nothing was built to take their place. The communities were simply left without the institutions that had sustained them for centuries. Robert Aske chose petition over attack. The Pilgrimage of Grace marched under the banner of the 5 wounds of Christ. The pilgrims did not burn manor houses. They did not seize castles. They did not kill the king's officials. They presented grievances. They asked for the monasteries to be restored. They requested a free parliament. Aske believed that if the king heard the true voice of his people, the dissolution would stop. He staked 30,000 lives on the proposition that Henry VIII was capable of listening. The proposition was wrong, but it was not irrational. The pilgrims had leverage. 30,000 armed men in the north represented a military force the crown could not easily defeat in the field. Aske did not use that leverage. He believed words would be enough. He believed the king's word would be enough in return. Henry offered a general amnesty, a full royal pardon for all participants, issued under the Great Seal. Aske accepted it. He ordered the pilgrims to disband. 30,000 men went home. The amnesty was a tactical lie. Within months, Henry used minor local disturbances as a pretext to revoke the pardons. Over 200 people were arrested and executed. The pardon that had been issued under the Great Seal, the highest instrument of royal authority, was treated as though it had never existed. The rebels who had trusted the king's word discovered that the king's word was a weapon, not a promise. Amnesty offered. Amnesty accepted. Arms laid down. Amnesty revoked. The sequence was not a failure of negotiation, it was a planned operation. The lie and the punishment were components of a single design. The pattern of offering peace to disarm an opponent, and then destroying the disarmed opponent, recurs across centuries of statecraft. It was not new when Henry used it, it was simply efficient. Robert Aske was taken to York. He was not hanged until dead. He was hung alive in chains from the city walls and left there. The death that followed was not from the executioner's hand. It was from exposure, thirst, and starvation, measured in days rather than minutes. Anyone entering or leaving York during that period passed beneath a man who was still breathing, still conscious, suspended from the walls of the city he had tried to save. The display was not incidental, it was architectural. Aske was converted from a man into a feature of the city itself, a message embedded in the masonry. The duration, the visibility, the location, all of it was chosen to ensure that the people of York would live inside the consequences of the pilgrimage for as long as Aske remained on the wall. Historian R.W. Hoyle at the University of Central Lancashire documented the post-amnesty executions in his study of the pilgrimage, published in 2001, recording over 200 confirmed deaths and noting the systematic geographic distribution of the punishments across the northern counties. But here is where the standard explanation falls apart. The standard reading is that Aske gambled and lost. He trusted a king, and the king betrayed him. But Aske did not gamble. A general amnesty issued under the Great Seal was the highest guarantee available in Tudor England. The Great Seal was not a rhetorical device. It was the physical instrument that validated the most binding acts of the crown. Aske did not trust Henry personally. He trusted the institutional weight of the seal. What the Pilgrimage of Grace proved was not that Aske was naive, it was that in Henry's England, the highest instrument of royal authority could be used as bait. The seal meant nothing, the pardon meant nothing. The entire apparatus of institutional trust had been hollowed out from the inside, and the people who relied on it had no way of knowing until it was too late. Aske trusted the seal because there was nothing higher to trust. There was no court above the king, no authority beyond the Great Seal, no institution that could hold the crown to its own word. He was hung alive from the walls of the city he loved, because the king understood that perfectly. The pardon was not a miscalculation that Henry later regretted. It was a tool. It worked exactly as designed, and the lesson it taught every subject in England was simple. There is no promise the crown cannot unmake. There is no document the crown cannot void. There is no word, however solemnly given, that is safe from the man who gave it. Number 3. Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury. On the morning of May 27, 1541, a warrant was delivered to the Tower of London for the execution of a prisoner who had been held without trial for over 2 years. The prisoner's name was Margaret Pole. She was 67 years old. She was the daughter of George, Duke of Clarence, and the niece of 2 kings of England. She was the last surviving member of the Plantagenet dynasty, the bloodline that had ruled England for over 300 years. The warrant did not specify what she had done, it specified what she was. The execution took place on Tower Green, not Tower Hill. That distinction mattered. Tower Hill was public, Tower Green was private, enclosed within the tower walls, visible only to a small number of officials and witnesses. The morning was confined and quiet. The block was low. The audience was small. The absence of the public crowd that attended most Tudor executions gave the proceedings an intimacy that made what followed worse, not better. This was not a spectacle designed for the city. This was a killing conducted in a small enclosed space, witnessed by a handful of people who would carry the details out with them and never be able to set them down. Margaret Pole was a countess. She was the former governess to Princess Mary. She was a woman of the highest birth in England, older than Henry's own mother would have been had she lived. None of it mattered. Her son, Reginald Pole, had publicly denounced Henry from the safety of the continent. He had written against the king. He had urged Catholic princes to act against England. He was beyond Henry's reach. Margaret was not. She was arrested and held in the Tower, while Henry attempted to use her as leverage to force Reginald's return. Reginald did not return. Margaret remained. The charge was treason by association, a mother punished for words spoken by a son she could not control, in a country she could not reach. Her bloodline was the crime. Her son gave the excuse. Everything else was administrative procedure. The executioner assigned to Margaret Pole was inexperienced. Some accounts describe him as young and unpracticed. Margaret reportedly refused to kneel at the block. One version of the account claims she told the executioner that she was no traitor, and that traitors knelt, and she would not. What followed was not an execution in any professional sense of the word. The first blow struck her shoulder. She moved. The axe came down again and struck her in a different place. The accounts vary in their specifics but converge on the same set of details. Multiple blows. The body in motion. The axe failing to find its mark. A standard noble execution required a single stroke from a skilled headsman. Margaret Pole's death required many. That is the distance between what was supposed to happen and what did happen, measured in the number of times a blade had to fall before a 67-year-old woman stopped moving. Margaret Pole was the last Plantagenet. The dynasty that had produced Edward III, Henry V, the entire Wars of the Roses, and 3 centuries of English kingship ended on Tower Green that morning. 300 years of royal blood terminated in a private enclosure with a handful of witnesses and an executioner who could not do his job. The Plantagenet line did not fall in battle. It did not end in a succession crisis or a plague or a natural extinction. It ended because a Tudor king decided that the existence of a single surviving Plantagenet, however old, however powerless, however far removed from any realistic claim to the throne, was an existence he could not tolerate. Her bloodline was older than his. That was enough. Historian Hazel Pierce at the University of Swansea compiled and compared the varying accounts of the execution in her biography of Margaret Pole, noting that while sources diverge on specific details, they uniformly describe a prolonged and incompetent killing that bore no resemblance to standard practice. But here is where the conventional reading collapses into something stranger. Margaret was not collateral damage for her son. Reginald Pole was a nuisance. Margaret was a Plantagenet. As long as she lived, the Plantagenet bloodline had a living representative whose claim to legitimacy predated the Tudors by centuries. Henry did not kill Margaret because he could not reach Reginald. He killed Margaret because Margaret was the last one. Her death was not a substitute for a punishment he could not deliver. It was the objective. The son gave him the pretext. The bloodline gave him the reason. What Henry extinguished on Tower Green was not a political threat. It was a genealogical fact that contradicted the Tudor claim to primacy. The old blood had to go. The Plantagenet dynasty did not fall in battle. It did not end in a succession crisis. It ended with a 67-year-old woman on Tower Green and a boy with an axe who could not finish what he started. The blows kept falling because the executioner lacked the skill to end it cleanly, and no one in the small audience stepped forward to stop it or to help. They stood and watched. And when it was over, 3 centuries of English royal lineage were gone, and the only evidence that it had ended badly was the testimony of the few people who had been close enough to hear it. Now step back for a moment. 9 entries, 9 acts of cruelty that trace a single arc. A cook boiled alive, a minister betrayed, a teenage wife executed, monks butchered for silence, a queen exiled to death, a conscience destroyed by the law it helped build, 200 rebels hung after a broken promise, an old woman hacked apart for her bloodline, a wife judicially murdered on fabricated charges. The scale has increased with every entry, from 1 man to 1 woman to a group of monks to 200 rebels. Each item has added weight. Each has widened the aperture. But every one of them, without exception, has been an act against a person or a group of persons. The final entry is different. The final entry is not about a person. It is about everything the persons left behind. Number 2. Anne Boleyn. 5 men were arrested in a single day. One of them was the Queen's own brother. The charges included adultery with the Queen and, in the brother's case, incest. The dates of the alleged encounters, when cross-referenced with surviving court records, placed Anne Boleyn at a different royal residence from the accused on several of the specified days. The evidence was internally contradictory. The verdicts were unanimous. And the woman at the center of it had fewer than 19 days left to live. The investigation was Cromwell's work. Mark Smeaton, a musician, was arrested and reportedly tortured until he confessed. Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton, and George Boleyn were taken the same day. The charges were engineered to be overwhelming in their scope rather than persuasive in their detail. Adultery made Anne a traitor under the Treason Act. Incest made the crime so repulsive that the public would not question the verdict. 5 co-accused made it appear systematic rather than isolated. The trial was presided over by Anne's own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk. The verdicts were returned the same day the evidence was heard. This was not a legal proceeding. It was an administrative procedure dressed in the language of justice. The dates were the tell. Court records survive that track the movements of the royal household. On several of the dates specified in the indictments as occasions of adultery, Anne was demonstrably at a different residence from the man she was allegedly in bed with. The distances involved were not ambiguous. They were miles apart. The contradiction was visible in the documents available to the court at the time of the trial. No one raised it. No one needed to. The charges were not meant to withstand scrutiny. They were meant to be read aloud, received without objection, and confirmed. The forensic framework was theater. The verdict existed before the first witness spoke. The executioner was brought from Calais, a French swordsman, not an English headsman with an axe. The sword was considered a more precise instrument and a mark of status. Henry made the arrangement himself. The logistical timeline is the detail that survives everything else. The swordsman was summoned from France before the trial was complete. The crossing from Calais, the travel arrangements, the fee, all of it was being organized while the court was still hearing evidence. The execution was being assembled before the verdict was delivered. That is not justice with a predetermined outcome. That is a schedule. Anne's marriage to Henry had been the legal justification for the break with Rome. The marriage produced Elizabeth. The break produced the Church of England. Anne's execution removed the cause but left the machinery intact. The Reformation did not die with Anne. It accelerated. The Church of England survived. The Act of Supremacy survived. The Dissolution survived. Every structure that had been built on the foundation of the Boleyn marriage continued to function after the marriage was annulled and the wife was dead. And this is where the hidden echo detonates. The Anglican Communion, the global network of churches descended from Henry's break with Rome, exists today in over 165 countries. Every Anglican service, every Episcopal church, every Book of Common Prayer used anywhere on earth exists downstream of a judicial murder built on charges that the court's own records contradicted. The institution survived the person. The person was the point of origin. The institution does not require her memory. It only required her existence, once, long enough to set the machinery in motion. Historian Eric Ives at the University of Birmingham, in his definitive biography of Anne published in 2004, cross-referenced the indictment dates with the court movement records and documented the contradictions that made the charges physically impossible on multiple counts. But here is where the standard explanation falls apart. The conventional reading is correct as far as it goes. Cromwell engineered it. Henry permitted it. A political faction wanted Anne removed and succeeded. But the political explanation is insufficient. Anne's execution was not just a successful conspiracy. It was a proof of concept. The legal system manufactured guilt from nothing. It applied that guilt unanimously. It processed 6 people on fabricated charges in under 3 weeks and executed the results on a precise schedule with imported equipment. The 5 men who died alongside Anne were not collateral damage. They were proof of throughput. The machine could handle 6 simultaneous fabrications without breaking stride. The demonstration was the point. The capacity was the message. The swordsman went back to France. The sword was not needed again, but the machine that summoned him never stopped running. It processed Cromwell 4 years later. It processed Catherine Howard 5 years after that. It processed anyone who became inconvenient on whatever charges were required at the speed the schedule demanded. Anne Boleyn was not the machine's target. She was its first full capacity test. And the machine passed. Number 1. The dissolution of the monasteries. On an ordinary morning in 1536, in a monastery somewhere in the English countryside, monks rose for matins, as they had every morning for centuries. They prayed, they ate, they tended the sick in the infirmary and the old in the almshouse. They taught the children in the school. They fed the poor who came to the gate. The rhythm had not changed in generations. It had not needed to. By the end of that year, the gate was locked, the school was empty, the infirmary was closed, and the lead was being stripped from the roof. Within 5 years, this scene would repeat itself at over 800 locations across England. Not one survived. The monasteries were not merely places of worship. They were the welfare state of medieval England. The nearest hospital in most of rural England was a monastic infirmary. The nearest school was a monastic school. The nearest shelter for a traveler was a monastic hostel. The nearest daily meal for a destitute family was at a monastic gate. Over 800 religious houses provided these services across the country. The estimated number of hospital beds, school places, and charitable meals provided daily by the monastic system ran into the tens of thousands. That is enough to fill a mid-sized town every single day with people who had no other source of medical care, education, or food. When the monasteries closed, the number of institutions that replaced them was 0. Nothing was built. The beds vanished, the schools vanished, the meals vanished, the communities that had depended on them for generations were simply left without, and told nothing about what was supposed to come next. Nothing did. The physical substance of the monasteries was converted into profit with systematic efficiency. Lead was stripped from roofs and melted into ingots for sale. Stained glass windows were smashed, not for the glass but for the lead framing between the panes. Timber was pulled from roof lines and sold. Stone was carted away to build manor houses for the new landowners who purchased the monastery sites at auction. Church bells, some of which had rung at the same hours for 300 years, were melted down for their metal. Precious metals from altar furnishings, candlesticks, reliquaries, and chalices were seized for the royal treasury. The process was not destruction in the chaotic sense. It was disassembly, a systematic, methodical conversion of 800 years of accumulated architecture into raw materials and cash. Every monastery was a building that had taken decades or centuries to construct. Every monastery was reduced to its component materials in weeks. The libraries were the loss that can never be quantified. Monastic scriptoria had spent centuries copying, preserving, and illuminating manuscripts. The contents of those libraries included not only religious texts but legal records, land surveys, medical treatises, agricultural manuals, historical chronicles, and astronomical observations. When the monasteries closed, the books were scattered. Some were purchased by collectors, some were used by local tradespeople as wrapping paper, book bindings, or fuel. Some were burned. The knowledge lost cannot be calculated because the records of what the libraries contained were destroyed alongside the books themselves. The question of how the logistical apparatus was capable of dismantling over 800 institutions across the full geography of England in under 5 years remains difficult to answer. Even with Cromwell's administrative machinery running at full capacity, the speed implies a level of coordination, documentation, and enforcement that strains the limits of what a 16th-century bureaucracy should have been able to produce. The ruins survive. Fountains Abbey in Yorkshire, Reval, Tintern in Wales, Glastonbury, Whitby. Tourists visit them. They photograph the arches. They admire the proportions. They call them beautiful. The beauty is the scar. Every roofless nave open to the sky, every wall standing without a ceiling, every staircase that climbs to a doorway that opens onto nothing, is not a relic of time. It is not the natural decay of an abandoned building. It is the result of a specific decision made by a specific king in a specific decade. The weather did not take the roofs off. Henry did. The rain that falls through the open arches falls through spaces that were enclosed for centuries. The tourists who stand in those spaces are standing inside the evidence of a deliberate destruction and calling it picturesque. The commissioners who carried out the dissolution were instructed to inspect each monastery and produce evidence of corruption, immorality, and financial mismanagement to justify closure. When the evidence did not exist, the commissioners produced it anyway. The Compendium Compertorum, the summary document compiled from the inspections, reported virtually identical findings of sexual misconduct and financial irregularity at hundreds of institutions scattered across the entire country. The uniformity is its own indictment. The probability that hundreds of independent religious communities, each operating under different leadership in different counties with different local conditions, all exhibited the same specific patterns of corruption, is vanishingly small. The report was not an investigation. It was a template, applied uniformly to justify a conclusion that had been reached before the first commissioner walked through the first monastery door. Historian G.W. Bernard at the University of Southampton analyzed the Compendium Compertorum in his study published in 2011, documenting the patterns of uniformity across the reports and noting that the consistency of the findings across geographically dispersed institutions is more consistent with a centrally directed narrative than with independent investigation. But here is where the nightmare begins. The standard reading is that Henry wanted the money. The monastic lands were worth a fortune. The precious metals were worth a fortune. The lead and timber were worth a fortune. Greed explains the seizure. But greed does not explain the libraries. The books had no resale value to the crown. The manuscripts were not melted down for gold. They were destroyed, scattered, or left to rot. The libraries were not an afterthought. They were an obstacle. The monastic system preserved not just religious texts, but the legal records, historical chronicles, and land surveys that constituted the institutional memory of the English countryside. A population with access to its own records could challenge the crown's version of events. A population that could read its own history could question when that history was rewritten. The destruction of the libraries was not negligence, it was strategy. The burning of the books was the point. The land and the gold were the profit. The silence was the product. The thing that made Henry VIII a monster was not what he did to the living. 9 items on this list describe acts of cruelty against persons. A cook boiled, a minister betrayed, a teenage girl destroyed, monks butchered, a queen exiled, a conscience murdered by the law it helped build, rebels hung from walls after a broken promise, a dynasty ended with a dull axe, a wife killed on charges her own accusers knew were false. All of those were acts against people. The dissolution was an act against memory. Henry did not just kill the people who opposed him, he killed the civilization that would have remembered them. The monasteries stood for 800 years. The knowledge they held is gone. The ruins remain, roofless, open to the sky, photographed by tourists who will never know what the buildings once contained. They remember nothing. That was the design. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now, and make sure to subscribe.